There is a field in Surrey. Flat, quiet, unremarkable. Dog walkers cross it without looking down. Joggers pass through without stopping. Nothing about this patch of ground suggests that beneath it lies the ghost of one of the most extraordinary buildings ever constructed in England. But in 1538, this was the site of something so ambitious, so extravagant, that Henry VIII named it Nonsuch, because there was to be none such like it in the entire world. Nonsuch Palace was Henry's obsession. A building designed not just to house a king, but to announce to every monarch in Europe that England had arrived. Its walls were covered in nearly 700 hand-sculpted stucco panels depicting gods and heroes. Its towers rose like nothing England had seen before. An Italian visitor who saw it with his own eyes declared it a work beyond the power of most sovereigns of the world. And yet today, nothing remains. Not a wall, not a tower, not a single room, because in 1682, a king's mistress, drowning in gambling debts, had the entire palace ripped apart and sold for scrap. This is the dark story of Henry VIII's lost palace. To understand Nonsuch, you have to understand the man who built it, and the rivalry that consumed him. By 1538, Henry VIII was 46 years old. He had broken with Rome. He had dissolved the monasteries. He had executed 2 wives. And he had just celebrated the birth of his son Edward, the heir he had torn England apart to produce. Henry had spent decades reshaping England in his own image. He had declared himself supreme head of the church. He had seized monastic wealth on a scale not seen since the Norman conquest. But for all his power, there was one arena where Henry felt outmatched: architecture. His rival, Francis I of France, had built the Château de Chambord, a palace of such staggering scale that it had become the envy of every court in Europe. Chambord had 440 rooms, 84 staircases, and at its centre, a double helix staircase designed by Leonardo da Vinci himself, 2 intertwined spirals that allowed people to ascend and descend without ever meeting. It was engineering as spectacle, architecture as propaganda. Francis had also transformed Fontainebleau into a Renaissance masterpiece, importing Italian artists to cover its walls and ceilings in frescoes and stucco, work the likes of which Northern Europe had never seen. The Fontainebleau became the standard by which royal palaces were judged. Every visiting ambassador carried home reports of its grandeur. Henry had Hampton Court. It was impressive, the largest palace in England. But it was not Chambord, it was not Fontainebleau, and Henry knew it. So on the 22nd of April, 1538, the first day of his 30th regnal year, Henry ordered the construction of something that would surpass them all, a palace so magnificent that its very name would declare its supremacy. There was just one problem: the site he had chosen was not empty. The medieval village of Coddington stood in the way. It was a small, ancient settlement in the Surrey countryside, the kind of place that had existed for centuries without attracting much attention. It had a manor house, a great barn, a 12th century church dedicated to St. Mary the Virgin, and a churchyard where generations of local families had buried their dead. Henry had it all destroyed. The church was pulled down stone by stone. The graves were dug up and the remains relocated. The manor house was demolished. The barn was levelled. The villagers, farmers, labourers, families who had lived on this land for generations were compensated and displaced. Not generously, just enough to make it legal. Every trace of Coddington was erased from the landscape. The village that had stood there since before the Norman conquest simply ceased to exist. In its place, Henry would build his monument. It is worth pausing on this. Henry VIII did not build Nonsuch on empty ground. He did not find a convenient hilltop or a stretch of unused royal land. He actively chose to obliterate a community so that his palace could rise from nothing. Coddington was not in the way of progress. It was in the way of Henry's ego, and the people who lost their homes, their church, and the graves of their ancestors had no power to stop him. This is how Nonsuch began. not with a foundation stone, but with a demolition. With Cuddington gone, construction began immediately. The workforce numbered around 500 men: carpenters, masons, plasterers, labourers, all directed by the architects Christopher Dickinson and William Clement, the same team responsible for the expansion of Hampton Court. But Henry wanted more than English craftsmanship. He wanted something England had never seen before. And for that, he needed to look abroad. Henry recruited Nicholas Bellin of Modena, an Italian stucco master who had worked at Fontainebleau for Francis I himself. This was not subtle. Henry was poaching his rival's finest craftsmen and turning his talent against his former patron. If Henry could not outbuild France through English hands alone, he would import the very artists who had made France great and set them to work for England instead. Bellin brought with him a technique that was entirely new to English soil: large-scale stucco panels sculpted in high relief, modelled by hand directly onto the walls, not pressed from moulds, but shaped and carved in situ by master craftsmen working at height. The level of skill required was extraordinary. Each panel had to be completed while the plaster was still wet, meaning speed and precision were inseparable. Bellin's team, which included the English craftsman William Kendall and the foreign plasterer Giles Geringe, would ultimately produce 695 individual stucco panels. They depicted scenes from classical mythology, allegories of the liberal arts, and representations of the cardinal virtues and vices. The figures were 3/4 life-size, framed in carved and gilded guilloche borders set into slate. Black slate borders were incised and painted around each composition. The effect, by every contemporary account, was overwhelming. There was nothing like it anywhere in England, nothing even close. The palace itself was built around 2 courtyards and stretched roughly 355 feet by 170. It was likely the largest timber-frame structure ever erected in England. Over 3,600 loads of chalk and stone were delivered to the site during construction. Some of that stone came from Merton Abbey, one of the monasteries Henry himself had dissolved just years earlier. He was recycling the bones of the old religious order to build a monument to the new Tudor one. The layout told the story of 2 different architectural worlds colliding. The outer courtyard was relatively restrained, a stone-faced entrance with a large gatehouse designed in a traditional medieval style. Visitors arriving at Nonsuch would first pass through a space that looked familiar, even conservative. It said, "This is England." But step through the second gatehouse into the inner courtyard, and everything changed. Here was where Bellin's stucco panels blazed across every surface. Here were the tall, octagonal towers rising from each corner, unlike anything in English architecture. The north face of the palace looked like a medieval fortress. The south face looked like something transported wholesale from the Italian Renaissance, ornate, exuberant, and deliberately provocative. Nonsuch was a building at war with itself, half English tradition, half continental revolution. And that was entirely the point. Henry was declaring that England could absorb the best of European culture and still remain unmistakably English. The palace was not an imitation of Chambord or Fontainebleau. It was Henry's answer to them. Inside, the rooms were appointed for a king, royal chambers, privy chambers, and presence chambers, a privy gallery for the king's private contemplation, chapels for worship, and extensive formal gardens surrounding the palace, knot gardens, fountains, and topiary arranged with the geometric precision that Tudor taste demanded. The cost was staggering, at least £24,000. Some accounts put it as high as £25,000. This made Nonsuch the third most expensive building project of Henry's entire reign, behind only Hampton Court and Whitehall. In today's money, that is roughly £10.5 million, and much of it was funded by the wealth Henry had seized from the dissolved monasteries, money that had once built churches, now repurposed to build a palace. The name appeared in building accounts within 2 months of construction starting: Nonsuch. Nonsuch. There is nothing like this. It was not a name chosen after completion, in admiration of the finished product. It was a declaration of intent from the very beginning. Henry named his palace before it was built, betting on his own ambition. Construction took years. The main structure was substantially complete by 1541, but finishing work, the interiors, the gardens, the fine details continued long after. The palace was still not fully finished when Henry died in January 1547, 9 years after he had ordered Cuddington destroyed to make way for it. And here is the part that makes this story truly dark. In those 9 years, Henry VIII visited Nonsuch Palace exactly 3 times, twice in 1545, once in 1547, the final year of his life. 3 visits, that is all. He had obliterated a village, spent a fortune that could have fed thousands, employed 500 men for nearly a decade, stolen France's finest craftsmen, produced something that visitors from across Europe called one of the wonders of the age, and he barely set foot in it. The palace was still unfinished when they carried Henry's body away. The king, who had dreamed of a building without equal, never lived to see it completed. Nonsuch was Henry's masterpiece, and Henry barely knew it. After Henry's death, Nonsuch entered a strange period of uncertainty. His son, Edward VI, inherited it, but Edward was a sickly child who had little opportunity to enjoy his father's creation. He died in 1553 at the age of 15. Mary I succeeded him. She was Henry's eldest daughter, the Catholic queen who had watched her father tear England away from Rome, annul his marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and declare her illegitimate. Mary had little sentimentality about Henry's legacy. In 1556, she sold Nonsuch Palace to Henry FitzAlan, the 19th Earl of Arundel. It was FitzAlan who finally completed what Henry had started. He poured his own considerable wealth into the palace, finishing the interiors and furnishing the rooms to a standard worthy of the extraordinary exterior. By 1559, 21 years after construction had begun, Nonsuch Palace was finally complete. When FitzAlan died in 1580, the palace passed to his son-in-law, John Lumley, the first Baron Lumley, and it was Lumley who gave Nonsuch something it had never had under Henry, a purpose beyond vanity. Lumley was one of the great intellectual figures of Elizabethan England. He was a collector on a scale that few of his contemporaries could match. He amassed one of the largest private libraries in the country, thousands of volumes covering theology, science, history, and the classics. And he housed it all at Nonsuch. Under Lumley's stewardship, the palace was transformed. It was no longer merely a statement of royal power. It became a genuine centre of learning and culture. Lumley filled the rooms with paintings, sculptures, and antiquities collected from across Europe. He maintained the gardens with care. He treated the building not as an asset to be exploited, but as a legacy to be preserved. But Lumley's finances were precarious. Despite his cultural ambitions, he could not sustain the cost of maintaining a palace on this scale. Between 1590 and 1592, he sold Nonsuch back to the crown, specifically to Elizabeth I. The price was remarkably modest, lands valued at just £534. Lumley stayed on as keeper of the palace, continuing to care for the building and its grounds even after it was no longer his. Elizabeth had always loved Nonsuch. She had visited frequently as FitzAlan's and Lumley's guest, and now that it was hers, she made it a regular summer residence. The deer park was perfect for her favourite pursuit, hunting. Every summer, the Queen and her court would descend on Nonsuch, and for a few glorious decades, the palace experienced exactly the kind of royal attention that Henry had always intended for it. It is one of the great ironies of Nonsuch that the monarch who enjoyed it most was not the king who built it, but the daughter he once declared illegitimate. Elizabeth gave the palace the life Henry never could. When Elizabeth died in 1603, Nonsuch passed to James I. He gave it to his wife, Anne of Denmark, while as part of her jointure, the property settlement that provided for the Queen's financial independence. The palace continued to serve as a royal retreat. James and Anne's eldest son, Prince Henry, spent considerable time at Nonsuch. He was widely regarded as the most promising heir England had seen in generations. Intelligent, cultured, and physically vigorous, Henry studied in Lumley's library, surrounded by thousands of volumes that the old baron had spent a lifetime collecting. He hunted in the grounds. He was, in many ways, the kind of prince that Henry VIII would have wanted to inherit Nonsuch. But Prince Henry died of typhoid fever in 1612, at the age of 18, another promise unfulfilled within Nonsuch's walls. Lord Lumley himself had died in 1609, after nearly 3 decades as the palace's devoted custodian. His death severed the last personal connection to the era when Nonsuch had been loved and maintained by someone who understood its value. For over a century after Henry VIII's death, Nonsuch had endured. It was completed, furnished, filled with art and books, and used by monarchs as Henry had intended. It hosted queens and scholars and princes. It was, in every meaningful sense, the palace of Henry's dreams, even if he never lived to see it fulfilled. But the Stuarts would not protect it forever. To understand how Nonsuch Palace was destroyed, you need to understand one woman, Barbara Villiers. Barbara was born in 1640 into a royalist family that had been ruined by the English Civil War. Her father, Viscount Grandison, had died fighting for Charles I when Barbara was just 2 years old. The family lost their estates, and their income and their position. Barbara grew up knowing what it meant to have everything taken away. She was determined that it would never happen to her again. Barbara was ambitious, ruthless, and by every account strikingly beautiful. By the time Charles II reclaimed the English throne in 1660, Barbara had already positioned herself as his mistress, a role she would exploit more effectively than almost anyone in English history. Her timing was perfect. Charles had returned from exile to a country desperate for celebration after years of Puritan austerity under Cromwell. The Restoration Court was extravagant, permissive, and openly hedonistic. Mistresses were not hidden, they were displayed, and Barbara was displayed more prominently than anyone. She bore Charles at least 5 children, all of whom he acknowledged publicly. She was installed in apartments at Whitehall, directly within the royal palace. She accumulated titles, properties, and financial grants at a pace that scandalized even the famously tolerant Restoration Court. The diarist Samuel Pepys recorded the gossip about Barbara with a mixture of fascination and horror. She was the most talked about woman in England. Rivals came and went. Louise de Keroualle, the French noblewoman sent by Louis XIV to seduce Charles and influence English policy. Nell Gwynn, the actress from Drury Lane whose wit and charm made her a popular favourite. But for over a decade, Barbara remained the dominant force in Charles's private life. Her influence over the king translated directly into political power, and more importantly, into wealth. In 1670, Charles granted her Nonsuch Palace. Now this was not a casual gift. Along with the palace itself, Barbara was created Baroness of Nonsuch, a title drawn directly from the property. Charles was handing her one of the most symbolically loaded buildings in England, the palace that Henry VIII had commissioned to declare Tudor supremacy to the entire world, a building that had housed Elizabeth I, that had sheltered Prince Henry, that had contained one of the greatest libraries in the country. Barbara did not care about any of that. What Barbara cared about was money, and she never had enough of it. Despite the enormous wealth Charles lavished upon her, estates, pensions, gifts, Barbara was a compulsive gambler. The card tables and dice games of Restoration London consumed fortunes nightly, and Barbara played with reckless abandon. She lost repeatedly, spectacularly, and without apparent concern for the consequences. Her debts mounted year after year. Her income, vast as it was, could not keep pace with her losses at the table. By the early 1680s, Barbara's position at court had weakened. Charles had other mistresses. Her political influence had faded, but her debts had not, and so she turned to the one asset she possessed that could be converted into immediate, substantial cash. In 1682, Barbara obtained a warrant to demolish Nonsuch Palace. Think about that for a moment. A building that had taken Henry VIII 9 years and £24,000 to construct. A building completed and furnished by the Earl of Arundel, filled with one of England's greatest libraries by Lord Lumley, used as a summer palace by Elizabeth I, given to a queen consort by James I. A building that an Italian visitor had described as beyond the power of most sovereigns of the world. Demolished. For gambling debts, the demolition was not haphazard. This was not a building left to crumble over decades of neglect. It was a systematic, organised dismantling carried out with one purpose: to extract every last piece of saleable material as efficiently as possible. Work crews moved through the palace methodically. The timber was stripped from the roofs and framing. Thousands of beams and joists from what had been the largest timber frame structure in England. The lead was pulled from the gutters, the downpipes, the roofing. Lead was valuable. Every sheet was accounted for. The stone was hauled from the walls and foundations, including the stone that Henry had taken from the dissolved Merton Abbey, and now being stripped from its second home. The slate cladding was prized from the exteriors. Glass was removed from windows. Metal fittings were extracted, and bell and stucco panels, those 695 hand-sculpted masterpieces that had made Nonsuch unlike any building in England, were destroyed. Plaster does not survive demolition. The gods and heroes, the allegories of virtue and vice, the three-quarter life-size figures that Nicholas Bellin had shaped with his own hands while balanced on scaffolding over 140 years earlier. All of it was reduced to rubble and dust. The bulk of the salvaged materials was sold to George Berkeley, the first Earl of Berkeley, who had served as keeper of the palace since 1660. Berkeley knew exactly what the building contained and what it was worth. He transported the stone, timber, lead, and fittings to his mansion at Cranford, where Henry VIII's palace was quietly absorbed into someone else's house. Nonsuch did not disappear. It was scattered. Some pieces travelled further. Wooden panelling from the palace found its way to the Great Hall at Loseley Park near Guildford, where it can still be seen today. If you visit Loseley, you can run your hand along Tudor woodwork that once lined the corridors of Nonsuch, a fragment of Henry's dream, embedded in someone else's walls. By early 1683, the main buildings were gone. A palace that had taken nearly a decade to build and had stood for 145 years was reduced to foundations and rubble in a matter of months. There is something almost unbearably fitting about the way Nonsuch ended. Henry VIII built it to prove that nothing could match it. He named it as a boast. There is none such like this, and in the end, it was destroyed not by war, not by fire, not by revolution, not by any force that history would consider worthy of such a building. It was destroyed by the carelessness of someone who saw it as nothing more than a pile of materials to be sold. Henry built Nonsuch to be remembered forever. Barbara Villiers made sure it would be forgotten. For nearly 3 centuries after the demolition, Nonsuch existed only as an absence. Paintings showed what it had looked like. Engravings preserved its outline. Written descriptions recalled its grandeur, but the building itself was gone, and the land where it had stood returned to grass and silence. The grounds became Nonsuch Park, a stretch of open land straddling the boroughs of Ewell and Cheam in Surrey. Families picnicked on the lawns, children played, people walked their dogs across the exact spot where Henry's inner courtyard had once blazed with stucco gods and gilded slate, without the faintest idea of what lay beneath their feet. Then, in 1959, something extraordinary happened. A 22-year-old archaeologist named Martin Biddle, barely out of university, was given permission to excavate the site of Nonsuch Palace. What followed became one of the most important post-medieval archaeological digs in British history. Biddle's team carefully uncovered the foundations of the palace, revealing for the first time in nearly 3 centuries the actual scale and layout of what Henry had built. The footprint of the 2 courtyards emerged from the soil. The positions of walls, gatehouses and towers were mapped. The archaeological evidence confirmed what the historical descriptions had claimed. This had been an enormous and extraordinarily ambitious building, but it was the smaller finds that brought Nonsuch back to life. The team recovered luxury items, fragments of Venetian glassware and pieces of Italian Maiolica pottery, the kind of high-status goods that confirmed this had been a palace of international sophistication. Alongside these, they found everyday objects: combs, thimbles, cooking pots, buttons, the detritus of daily life in a building that had housed kings and servants alike. The excavation attracted over 75,000 visitors. People came from across England to stand at the edge of the trenches and look down at the bones of Henry's palace. For a brief period, Nonsuch was national news again, not for its grandeur, but for its absence. The dig made people confront what had been lost. More than that, the excavation was a watershed moment for British archaeology. Before Nonsuch, post-medieval sites were largely ignored by professional archaeologists. The assumption was that anything built after 1500 was too recent to merit serious excavation. Biddle's work at Nonsuch proved that assumption wrong. The site yielded information about Tudor architecture, construction techniques, material culture, and daily life that no written record could have provided. Nonsuch, even in death, was pioneering something new. In 2024, historic England returned to the site for further excavations. New technology and new questions brought archaeologists back to the ground that Biddle had first opened 65 years earlier. They uncovered additional walls, floor tiles, and artifacts that added fresh detail to the picture of what Nonsuch had been. Then they carefully reburied everything. The palace that Henry VIII built to be seen by the entire world now lies deliberately hidden beneath the earth, protected from the elements, protected from souvenir hunters, protected from the very forces of carelessness and greed that destroyed it the first time. It is, perhaps, the only way left to keep it safe. There is still a field in Surrey, flat, quiet, unremarkable, but if you stand in the right place and look down, for you are standing on the remains of the most ambitious palace Henry VIII ever conceived, a building where Italian masters sculpted gods and heroes into stucco walls, where Elizabeth I hunted every summer, where a young prince studied in one of England's greatest libraries, where a devoted baron spent his life preserving something he knew was irreplaceable, and where a king's mistress, buried in gambling debts, tore it all down and sold it for parts. Henry called it Nonsuch because he believed nothing would ever equal it. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. There is Nonsuch because there is nothing left at all.